Good evening, everybody. We are this evening at the 10th meeting of our seminar on the anthropological perspective on the COVID pandemic. We are very glad to greet the presence of Hans-Jörg Dilger and Dominic-Matt, who are speaking from the Freie Universität of Berlin. They are some of the very first colleagues that accepted our invitation. And although they are speaking in a later part of our seminar, we were sure of their presence since the beginning, and we are very, very happy of their presence, also because today they're going to present a very interesting a very interesting thing that they have managed to put on a blog on the called Witnessing Corona, through which they have monitored the situation during the last weeks and months. So I will leave the platform to my colleague and friend Pino Schiripa, who is going to moderate today. And I just wanted to remind you that the last two meetings that we have in schedule are next Thursday, the 30th of this month. We will have David Napier from the University College of London, and next week on Monday at the same hour of 6 o'clock p.m. We will have a Chinese colleague from Germany, also from the Max Planck Institute, and that will be the very last meeting of our seminar. We'll probably do some other things in September, but then we'll leave you in peace during the summer. And by the end of this week, we'll certainly have all of the meetings on the platform, on the site of the society. So Pino, please, you have the lead now, and I switch off my microphone and my camera. I invite all of the participants to do the very same. You have to click on the little icon on the left, on the lower left of the microphone and the camera, in order to have them become red. This is the only way they won't disturb the recording. And I will switch off and listen very attentively to this conference. I invite all the public to write down their questions, or to ask their questions verbally on the chat of the meeting. Thank you very much, Hans-Georg and Dominic, for being with us, and I'll listen very attentively to you. Thank you.
We don't hear you, Pino.
Sorry. Now you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dominic and Hans-Jörg, for being here. Thank you to all the conveners. And we were supposed to have 3 speakers today, but unfortunately, Nassima Selim, she couldn't come because she had a personal problem, so she couldn't be here. But let me say that we are sorry for that, and she is anyway a postdoctoral research at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and for sure we could take advantage of her presence, but we are very sorry. But it was also impossible to postpone the meeting. So I'm going just to introduce the other 2 speakers. So first one is Dominic-Matt. She's also a postdoctoral research at the Freie Universität in Berlin, and he did a PhD thesis, The Politics of Normalization, Providing a Living with Antiretroviral HIV Treatment in Northeastern Tanzania. And the referees were Hans-Jörg Dilger and Hélène Moyer. And he did a lot of work, of field work, both in Berlin, but especially also in Africa, as we see in Tanzania, but is now working in Berlin on religious diversity, and as me on Pentecostal, but he added also the Sufi orders. And he wrote a lot of things. Just let me mention the most recent one, which is Politicizing Elsewhere, Negotiating Representation of Neo-Pentecostal Aesthetic Practices in Berlin in Religion and Society. And with Bernard Hadold and Birgit Obrist, rethinking Sociality and Health through Transfiguration, Medicine, Anthropology, and Theory. And then also a lot of others, but I don't want to waste time. Now we go to Hans-Jörg Dilger, who is Professor of Social and Cultural Anthropology at Freie University in Berlin, but he is also co-convener of the Medical Anthropology Network within the European Association of Social Anthropology, as I was before. And he also did a lot of field work in Africa, and not only in Africa. And to mention all his publications is quite impossible, just in this case, even some recent one. In Mobility and Disconnectivity in Medical Globalization, How Global is Global Health, which is in a special issue of Global Public Health that was co-edited with Dominic. And Ethic, Epistemology and Engagement, Encountering Values in Medical Anthropology, and it was a special issue of Medical Anthropology, co-edited with Susan Uschke and Dominic Mattes again. And then Medicine, Mobility, Empowering Global Africa, Transnational Health and Healing. It is a book, an edited book, co-edited with Abulaye Kani and Stacy Landick. Okay, today they are going to talk about, I think it was the first thing that was planned in anthropology about the coronavirus. The blog they have started at the beginning of the pandemic, called Witnessing Corona. Is a blog hosted by Curare, which is the German Journal of Medical Anthropologists, and the Global South Studies Center in Cologne, and I think also Freie University in Berlin, even if it's not in the logo. And I remember that they immediately asked to all the people from all Europe who witnessed their experience with corona, with living during the pandemic. So for us, it's very interesting to hear today what they can say about this very important experience in the field of European medical anthropology. I don't want to waste other time, so I leave the floor to our two speakers, and after we will start with the question. You can just ask for question by the chat, or just raise the hand to ask the question, always by the chat. I'm going to turn off my microphone and my video too, and thank you very much for being here with us today, and we are very anxious to hear you.
Well, thank you very much, Pino and Alessandro, for the kind introduction, and of course also for the invitation to give a talk in your seminar series. It's very nice to be with you. Thank you also obviously to Ivo Caranta, who's not here today. Yeah, we are happy to present our blog series, Witnessing Corona, to you. It's a shame that we can't see you, but we are also grateful that for all the participants who are there, and we hope that we will have a good conversation and discussion afterwards, after the talk. Dominic, we have prepared a presentation, and Dominic is uploading the presentation now, I think. And and we split up the talk. So what we want to focus on in our talk is this collaborative blog project with Corona, which has run since the end of March. It's a collaborative project, and Dominic is going to say more about it in the second part of the presentation. It's a collaboration between different actors. Pino mentioned already the Global South Studies Center in Cologne. It's the Curare, the Journal for Medical Anthropology. But it's also, and that's where we come in, our group, the working group Medical Anthropology within the German Anthropological Association. And from this side, from this working group Medical Anthropology, we are 4 co-editors. It's Dominic, me, it's Nassima Selim, who was already mentioned, and Claudia Lang. So it's a shame that Nassima Selim can't be with us today. She had an accident with the bicycle. She will be fine, so it's not too serious, but for this week she's sick and unable to join us today. What we are going to do in this talk is first, I'm going to introduce the larger background for the blog, just to explain how the situation, if you switch slides, Dominic. It's the response to COVID-19 in Germany, which explains somehow the background of how we established the blog and how we saw there's a role and an importance also for a response, also for a public response also from anthropology, and why we chose the format of the blog. And then in the second part, we are going to elaborate on the blog, how it was established, what it's doing, the kind of contributions it is publishing. That's what Dominic is going to do this part, and it's a bit behind the scenes of the blog and behind our practices and of editing the blog. So I come to the first part now, and obviously if we talk about the response to COVID-19 in Germany, it's always good starting as anthropologists with our own positionalities. I think there's some, with our own positionalities. When we prepared the talk, we realized that we came from very different positions when we started the blog. Nassima at the time was in India in March. She had started to do preliminary fieldwork for her new research project on air pollution and urban precincts. So it's very fitting in a way with the topic of COVID-19 then, but so she had been there for only 2 weeks when she and prepared in a way the first conversations, established some access to possible interview partners, and then the question came up whether she should return to Germany. That was in mid-March. And she, because in the beginning, the situation was actually worse in Germany than in India. So, but she was wondering whether she should stay on in India and continue with her field work. But then she also realized that obviously, I mean, the flights between India and Germany were increasingly canceled. So it became also increasingly difficult for her to get out of India and return to Germany. And so she decided to take the next flight back. And that's where we came together again virtually, then in March, or in the second half of March, when we decided to establish the blog. For me, it was also it started when I was in early March. I was still at a workshop in California at Stanford University. I went there for a workshop on religion and development. This was on the 6th and 7th of March, but I had already left on the 4th of March because I wanted to be there for a day early because of the jet lag. And the situation in Germany at the time wasn't really that bad yet. We had heard the news from Italy, from Spain, obviously also. But in Germany, everything was moving towards a more serious situation, but it was still very uncertain. And in this context, I still decided to go to this conference. But when I arrived there at San Francisco airport, the situation was already quite different. So there were posters everywhere in the bathrooms. The border officers and the police officers, they were all wearing masks. Certain cautionary measures were already taken. So it looked already very different when I was there. And in fact, the workshop, which I had aimed to attend, was actually cancelled. So the messages were sent out while I was on the long distance flight. And when I arrived there at the hotel, I was informed that in the meantime, the workshop had been cancelled. This was then a university policy. So this was unfortunate, and but several other people who had also traveled from a long distance had already arrived. We were like 3 or 4 people. Other people were locally present. So we decided to do a mini workshop nevertheless on Friday, March 6th. And then in the same evening, I returned to Germany. And from there on, everything actually went very quickly. Switch slides. Doesn't.
No. No.
Yeah. So within the next week on March 16, all the playgrounds in Berlin were closing down, and also the schools were closed. And you see that's a sign in German, obviously, from a playground, which was then locked, and it was forbidden for families to take their children there. And then on the left, top left, you see a map of Germany. And there the schools were closed starting Monday, March 16. But you can also see that there was a diversity of situations because Germany is a federal state. So not all federal states moved in the same rhythm in regard to this lockdown or the closing of schools. So the red federal states there, the schools were closing on March 16. And you see, for instance, in the south, Bavaria, where the situation was much worse than, for instance, in Berlin, they were also closing their schools quite early. But for instance, in Baden-Württemberg, which is west of Bavaria, they took a few days longer. So this created, in the first days actually of this epidemic in Germany, and in the first days of establishing the lockdown, this created also quite some confusion and uncertainty among the population, because obviously the central government, or the government, the Ministry of Health, they were publishing information, and they were also informing about the seriousness of the epidemic. They were giving advice, but ultimately it was upon the federal states to take these measures and to implement them. So there was this diversity of the rhythm and of temporalities within Germany. And as I said, there was a lot of confusion also going on within the population. And some people, in a way, were expecting more drastic measures, and they were hoping that all these measures would have been taken more quickly. The same happened with the closing of shops. It's on the next slide. So in Berlin, again, the shops were closed starting on March 18, so 2 days later than the schools. And here you say, for instance, one little shop which said short break, kurze Pause. So that's what, in a way, many of these shops were also expecting in the beginning. It's going to be a short break. They weren't really expecting that this is going to take very long. But then one institution after the other was being closed, and people were moving to their home offices, like in many other places in Europe. And this took then quite a long time, actually until early May, when these measures were gradually taken back, and all these different places were going to reopen again, one after the other. But still, it took quite some time. And for instance, the schools are not fully open again yet, and also the universities. We are still working mostly from home, and this is going to continue until the winter semesters. Including in the winter semester, we are going to teach online, and most of us are going to stay home most of the time, or going to the office only 1 day per week or so. On the left picture, you see also, on the other hand, in early March, or in this time in mid-March, then certain solidarity initiatives were coming up. There were especially young people offering assistance for shopping to old people who had to stay home, who belonged to the risk groups. Yeah, I think there's some microphones on. If it's possible to close them. So the solidarity initiatives were there, but they were not as strong or as elaborate as, for instance, you've seen it probably also in Italy, or as in Spain, where I was more familiar, or where I followed the situation more closely. Next slide. So with all these various measures, the effect of the lockdown were actually quite positive. You see that in this graph, which shows the development of reported cases over time. So the peak was actually in late March, in this time around Easter, and then since then it gradually went down. And what was also interesting in the German case, that the death rate was actually comparatively low in comparison to other countries, in comparison to Southern Europe, but also obviously then in the UK, but also in the US, for instance. So far there is a little bit more than 9,000 people who have died from Corona, from COVID-19. And we had almost 200,000 confirmed cases. So the effects of this lockdown were actually quite positive. The lockdown was quite successful. I still put it in quotes because the lockdown was not as pervasive as, for instance, in Italy or in Spain. As in Spain, for instance, as we are all, I think, very aware, I mean, the measures were also very rigid. And in comparison to that, in Germany, people could still go out, leave their house for a walk, for leisure time. The lockdown was not enforced so rigidly by the police. For instance, you were not controlled in the streets when you were, or in very few cases at least. So in a way, people had also already adjusted their behaviors before the actual lockdown measures came. They had seen the situation in Italy developing via the news, but also in Spain. And so they had already adjusted their behaviors and had become more careful even before the lockdown measures were established. And this is one of the explanation why the epidemic has evolved in Germany the way it has done. Obviously, I mean, the healthcare system was also much more robust. It was very strong. There was all these responses with testing, with rigid testing and so on. But there was also a good portion of luck there, because yeah, we were later in the pandemic. We had seen what is happening in other places, and people were in a way more prepared for that, and also the politicians. And so there was this mixture in a way of luck, but also of a probably robust public health response, which turned out quite positive for how the pandemic evolved in Germany. So if we think about the role also of scholars and of the sciences in Germany, there were especially the virologists and the epidemiologists who took really center stage in the response to the epidemic. So this was also, I mean, if we compare it, for instance, to the US, the situation in the US, so virologists played an essential role in advising for being counselors to the government in relation to the public health response. And the government followed actually the advice of the virologists and of the epidemiologists very closely. There was, for instance, Christian Drosten, who is a virologist at the Charité, who has a bi-weekly, I think, a podcast, which has become incredibly popular also among the population. So the virologists were not only there in a way for the government to advise the government, but they were also in a way giving, spreading advice and information to the general population. As I said, the podcasts, or they were very present, also various virologists in all talk shows on the media, and Christian Drosten played a seminal role there. And there was almost a kind of star cult around these virologists. So, but obviously, where there's a star cult and where there's a lot of acceptance, there's also critique. And then starting, I think, in early May, the critique became increasingly loud. And there were all these hygiene demos, these so-called hygiene demonstrations, and there were all kinds of right-wing and also partly extremist left-wing people attending, but mostly from the right margins. But there were also these anti-vaccination groups mobilizing, and they were talking about a dictatorship that was being established through the pandemic control measures, through the lockdown measures. They were in a way lobbying or fighting for getting their basic rights back. They didn't want to have enforced vaccination. And as you see here with the picture in the middle, they were really, they were claiming that a dictatorship was being established through pandemic control. And on the right hand, you see a picture where you see that also some of this critique was directed back at the virologists and the epidemiologists, and especially Christian Drosten was in the focus of these verbal attacks. So here you see a poster that was could be seen in not in many places, but it circulated also via the social media. Trust me, I'm a doctor, where he was compared to Josef Mengele, the physician in the concentration camp during the Nazi times. So there was all this critique, and he received also various threats, and also other virologists, because in a way many people then said, or not many, it's still a larger or a minor part in a way of the population, but obviously they became increasingly loud also via social media and so on. And what they claimed is that the virologists in a way had exaggerated with their response, that they were to blame then also for the negative effects on the economy and so on, and that all these measures wouldn't have been needed. But the majority of the population, I think, and this is also shown by some of the statistics and by polls, they show that there's a broad support actually by the majority for the course of the government and for the public health response by the government and also for these virologists. So if you take the next slide, what was also interesting in Germany is actually there was also quite some response from the social sciences. And I think what is also quite unique is that these social scientific voices were also heard by the government. They were also very present in the public, in the major media outlets. So what they did is, in a way, talk very early on about the economic consequences beyond large companies, also the negative effects that the lockdown has, for instance, for individuals, but also for very small scale firms or companies. But also for artists and so on. So all these effects, these multiple effects, were also addressed very early on in the pandemic, and that was actually quite interesting compared, for instance, to the financial crisis in 2009-10, where all the focus of the government was really on saving the large companies and the banks. So this was very different. This time here, from the beginning, also individuals in a way were supported, all these small scale structures like cafes or small individual artists and so on. So there was quite a diverse response from the government in relation to this to the economic consequences of the pandemic. Then also social scientists in a way also addressed the negative effects that the pandemic and the lockdowns had on households and gender relations, especially in regard to the situation of the home office, the traditionalization of gender roles during the epidemic, the effects that the epidemic and the lockdown had on vulnerable groups, especially old people, partly also refugees and homeless people. And you see one of the solidarity responses on the right, you see this image, was the donation fences, which popped up again. For instance, in Berlin, they had been there already. This was a model which came, I think, from Hamburg. But during the refugee crisis in 2015-16, and now they were being re-established in multiple places, for instance, in Berlin, so people could hang their clothes or medication or anything they wanted to donate on this fence, and homeless people picked them up. There was also obviously quite some talk about the consequences and the impact the lockdown had on education, on schooling, much less in regard to universities. Universities, in a way, solved these issues for themselves. There was not a lot of public attention to them, and with the negative effects on culture also. In comparison to education, there was much less talk, but it was in a way also there that the cultural institutions were also suffering, and they were also then being supported by the government through certain measures. The next slide. So in a way, all these social scientific responses were mostly driven by sociologists, partly also by historians, partly by economists. And so what they did was that they focused actually very strongly also on the situation in Germany. There was some comparison also with the situation in Southern Europe, especially in Italy. Spain was largely absent actually from these discussions, from these comparative angles. A little bit on the situation in France, but also in the UK, a little bit in the US. But I think the media reporting and the social sciences in the media. They focused really mostly on Germany, and there was very little focus actually on global developments. Compared also to other social scientific responses and their presence in the media, the anthropological presence in larger media outlets was really limited. So I think in the beginning, in March, there was still quite some interest. I also gave several interviews. On the right, you see one interview I gave in a major Sunday newspaper, Die Welt. But what the journalists were really interested in when they asked anthropologists, they were interested in culture and in cultural difference. So they were asking, for instance, why is the situation so bad in Italy? And then they wanted to hear, in a way, because of the family structure. Or they were asking about the lockdown in China, and they wanted to, in a way, hear people act more collectively. And so they are, in a way, also accepting the lockdown in a very, or the quarantine measures in a very different way that they would do in individualistic Germany. So in a way, they had certain expectations when they asked their questions, and it was also not very satisfying in a way to answer these questions, because as anthropologists, we wanted also to talk, or I wanted to talk also about social relations, about power relations, about all these dynamics, how culture is intertwined actually with larger social and political and economic structures, but that was not really what the media were interested in so much. So when that was the situation in early to mid-March, and then when we got together with Dominic and Nassima, and then also the other actors that Dominic is going to talk about in a minute, that's where we decided that we are going to establish this blog, that we need a different kind of public response for ourselves, even if it may not have a very large impact or presence, but we wanted to discuss different topics, and we thought that we need to establish our own forum, since we didn't get our message across in the larger media outlets. So now it's Dominic's turn. And yeah.
Yes, thank you. I hope, Hans, can you hear me?
I can hear you well, yes,
okay.
Yeah.
So I hope everyone is hearing me. So yes, I'm taking over to give a glimpse behind the scenes of the Witnessing Corona blog series. But I'd also like to start with a kind of personal impression of these days, of the first, well, one or 2 weeks of March, when the blog came into being, so to say, just to give you another kind of perspective or glimpse of how it felt, how the pandemic kind of approached. And so yeah, Hans-Jörg already said we had these images, we saw and heard a lot about what was going on in Italy. We heard about or saw the media coverage on the regional lockdowns in northern Italy. Then it grew into the national lockdown. The schools had already been closed in Germany. The university was closed, so we were all kind of working at home. And generally, signs were kind of piling up, that a complete lockdown, at least a light form of a lockdown, as Hans-Jörg already mentioned, would also come quite soon. And since, well, I have 3 little children, they're 5, 7, and almost 1 year old. And it really stressed me, the idea to be locked up in the apartment. I mean, at that time, we didn't know how strict or restrictive a lockdown in Germany would be. And I was kind of counting with the worst case, and it really stressed me, this idea of being locked up with the children, with the kids in the apartment, perhaps without being allowed to go out and so forth. And so my partner and I spontaneously decided to pack the car and leave toward the south where my sister has a house in a little village. Do you actually see my cursor? Yeah, okay. So the village is called Buchholz. It's like 700-800 kilometers almost. It's like the longest stretch you can probably go within Germany from Berlin to Buchholz, which is here close to this little in the north of Freiburg. You probably know Freiburg at the foot of the Black Forest, and here is this little village. So we kind of fled there, knowing that she has a house with a garden, and the lockdown would be quite, a lot more comfortable to experience in such an environment. Buchholz, or this area here, it's the Rhine Valley between the Black Forest here in Germany on the eastern side of the Rhine, and I don't know what it is in English, the Vogesen, Vosges perhaps, or Les Vosges in French. And in the middle, we have this Rhine Valley, and it's an extremely fertile area. It's a very special climate, actually. It's very different from Berlin. It's quite a humid and hot climate, almost kind of Mediterranean sometimes. The Kaiserstuhl, this area is actually called Germany's Toscana, which you would probably laugh about, but it gives you an impression of, at least for German standards, it's really quite a special climate and situation there. And it makes this area quite fertile. And so this is one view from the border, the edge of the village toward the south, the northeast into the Black Forest, and you see the vineyards. So there's wine, lots of wine is grown there. We have large strawberry plantations, all kinds of things. Fruits are grown, asparagus, flowers. So it's in that regard, it's quite a special area. And so I want to give you two very short impressions of these, of how I experienced being there during these days. And the first impression has to do with this this agricultural intensity, so to say, because obviously, as in other countries, it is quite. You see now it works. Okay. Here you also see the fruit plantations on the right, and then this is the view toward the west, actually. So what you see on the horizon, it's the Vosges, that's France, and it's Alsace, where at that time Corona was already impacting the intensive care units quite heavily, and so we were very often taking walks through these fields, through these kind of plantations, or through the vineyards. And as in other parts, as I said, of Europe, the agriculture there is quite dependent on Eastern European seasonal laborers. And it was quite peculiar situation to walk, to be on the walk in the situation of increasingly restrictive social isolation, of the lockdown, and this kind of building up tenseness somehow. And then you always encounter these large white vans with European laborers jammed in the back of these vans, 15 people, standing shoulder to shoulder, no mask and so forth. And it was just quite peculiar to always experience these, as if there had been a veil between us, their situation, they have to go on with their work. They are living in very precarious conditions. They probably do not have the conditions to actually protect themselves from Corona. And I was always thinking about these issues. And then actually 2 weeks later, there was a first case in a large farm, or in a shelter of these laborers, HIV, I'm saying, a Corona positive case. And then this whole discussion about this very critical situation of the Eastern European seasonal laborers kind of gained traction in the media, but it actually took basically until now, where we had these, I don't know if some may have followed in the media about these mass outbreaks in the meat industry in North Rhine-Westphalia, where this same kind of, critical situation now actually gained the spotlight, is in the spotlight, and politics, enough pressure has built up for the politicians to finally attend to this issue. So that was the one kind of impression, and the other one is that my sister works in a large clinic in Freiburg. Her husband, my brother-in-law, is a general practitioner, and he has a practice in a nearby village. And through their perspective, we also gained a quite intense insight into, the medical infrastructure in the area, and this enormous tension building up of, being worried about the lacking, in the beginning, it was a lacking infrastructure too. The general practitioners didn't have any masks, no protective gears. They were really wondering how to actually stem this, what they expected to come anytime, once it was there. And so the situation was that, we were in the house every day, and when they came back from work, we always had these discussions. So what was it like today? Did the wave come? How many more patients were admitted to the intensive care unit? And all these questions, and always with this view into the symbolic view, kind of metaphorical view into the Alsace, into the situation there, through people we knew there, or colleagues of my brother-in-law working on the other side of the border, where they were really extremely struggling already. So this was the other kind of impression, this really impressive tension building up during these days. And then unfortunately, the actual, the expected tsunami never came. So this was the situation I was in, personally was in, when we kind of were thinking already about establishing this blog. In the beginning, we thought we just make a new series kind of on our blog, Medizinethnologie, which is medical anthropology. And we had published, well, that's another picture of my partners doing face masks. So this was kind of the, individual response to kind of respond to this infrastructural shortcoming. So we actually, my sister and my partner sewed lots of masks for the practice, for my brother-in-law's general practice. And we also try to, familiarize our children to this new situation, to the hygiene conditions, to the lockdown situation, and so forth, in a kind of playfully, not too frightening manner. Around the same time, during these days, we had already published this first piece by now I'm missing his name, Brandan Huygen. From South Africa, which is a very nice piece, because he was actually in Berlin until shortly before the lockdown came into action, and he just, in time flew back to South Africa, so shortly before the lockdown. And in his piece, he reflects about these very diverging political strategies of reacting during these first days when the pandemic kind of was, on the horizon, in Germany and South Africa, and the vast differences in the structural vulnerabilities of these very different, obviously, populations. And so we had published this one piece, and then we got this phone call by Ela Voss from the Curare, from this medical anthropology journal in Germany. And he was already also involved in this BOAS blogs, which is another blog actually, and they were also thinking about opening a new series. And so he asked whether we would be interested in actually joining them, in joining forces to reach a wider readership yeah, and in kind of delving into this Corona world, and we thought this was quite a good idea and agreed to from then on. So that's why we had one piece actually published outside of the series, which was then later labeled as part of the series. That was kind of the chronology. So this then came together, Witnessing Corona series, and Hans-Jörg and Pino already mentioned who was involved. So it's us from Freie Universität, or the medical anthropology work group within the German Anthropological Association, and then this Global South Studies Center, and Curare, and even other people from Boas Block. So it's quite a complex configuration. But it's also very good that we actually did join forces, and we successively recruited more and more people into the editorial team, because it was really a flood, that we were flooded by contributions during the first weeks, and it was hardly possible to kind of keep up with the editing work, even with these many people in the editorial team. So I wonder what we had done, what we would have done if we hadn't actually had such a team. Hans-Jörg and I don't know how we would have survived. So maybe some of you have taken a look at the contributions or at the series. And by now we have some 32 contributions, I think. The thematic, it's quite a wide thematic range, obviously, because Corona or COVID-19 touches basically every sphere of our lives, and this really is reflected quite well in the single contributions. I try to just come up with a few kind of, try to subsume them under a certain heading, and this is what I came up with. So this is just a very broad overview of themes, and then I will shortly switch to the blog itself and just quickly talk about single contributions, just to give you an idea of this enormous variety of themes that people were writing about. So the first one is experiencing, kind of more phenomenologically, subjectively tinged texts, how people were experiencing the lockdown and these weeks of isolation. We've had a number of contributions dealing critically with particular, mostly national strategies, political strategies of intervening, of countering the situation. In many texts deal with inequalities and unequal vulnerabilities, be they social, political, economic, or infrastructural. That was quite an important theme, across many contributions. A few texts specifically deal with the language, with the terminology in the media, for example, that has kind of developed throughout the weeks, and certain discourses, how Corona or the pandemic was actually talked about, or how certain actors within the pandemic were talked about. There were texts about this very specific dynamics of solidarity and blame. Others that attended to more kind of maybe more existential social moral dilemmas and transformations that were ongoing during the pandemic. And we also had two texts, I think, that in a more explicit way dealt with in a self-reflective way, dealt with the role of anthropology itself, of themselves as researchers. And I'll switch here, I hope this works, to the blog to just guide you through some of these contributions. So here you see the overview of all the pieces we have published so far. And then I kind of go through this list that this overview that I presented now. And I start with this theme of experiencing lockdown and isolation. So we just last week, I think, or 2 weeks ago, we published this. No, it is still quite on the 24th of June. we published this documentary by Anna Neuwer, In Isolation, where she interviewed people in her surrounding. She did these kind of Skype interviews and filmed them, how these people in her surrounding, in her circle of friends actually, or acquaintances, experienced isolation in Austria. We had a very nice piece by Eva Steinberger, 8th of May, where she specifically addressed the situation of students living through the situation of, you know, the university being closed, their jobs being deprived of their jobs, moving back home to their parents' house, and all these kinds of negotiations of social roles and psychological challenges that come along with this, with these dynamics. Then I'm moving on to the critical explorations of corona politics and responses. Here, for example, we had one contribution from by Alice Colombo on the situation in Ethiopia, where she kind of juxtaposes the partly conflictive strategies or agendas of political and religious actors that together kind of shaped what became Ethiopia's corona politics and also the people's response. That was quite an interesting contribution. Not too many were actually dealing with religion, so that's one of them. We had Gega Rianto also giving a kind of an insight into the political economic background of the governmental corona response and the very specific communication policy in Indonesia, which at least during the first couple of weeks was very much focusing on secrecy. We had a contribution by Giga Podgornik-Jakil, Stay Awake in the Time of Pandemic, which gives, which is a very nice observation of the very localized political strategies of shaping, or how local political geographies actually shape leftist and rightist protest movements against governmental corona responses in Germany and Slovenia. Kind of comparative contribution. We also had this contribution by Tunay Altai, which deals with the politics of belonging and its consequences for migrant residents in the context of border regimes and national return campaigns, which were a huge deal during the first couple of weeks to get all the national German citizens back into the country, but actually many people who did not have German citizenship, but perhaps residency, and actually defined their Germany as their home country, were left back. They were actually stuck abroad. So that's what he dealt with. We had also a one contribution. I don't know if a German contribution by Kim Radestock about the moral conflicts arising with the corona-related release of prisoners convicted of sexual assault in Argentina, which obviously then led to great conflicts when these kind of prisoners or the perpetrators were actually being released. They went back to their apartments, to their houses, where perhaps in the same house a victim of their violence was actually living. So it's about this very delicate situation. And with this, I come to the theme of the social, political, economic, and infrastructural inequalities and vulnerabilities. We had this now it's, I have to look for it. Yes, for example, well, this is probably taking too long to guide you through all these or many of these articles. So just as a few more examples, this is about this contribution by Ahud Ajit, teaching in times of Corona. It's also a very compelling description of the difficulties that teachers in Northeast India actually were experiencing in setting up these online teaching, platforms, and which many of their students were very poor students who were kind of resettled into their rural areas and had no online internet access, actually could not access. So it's about these kind of technological inequalities. Now let me pick a few more. This was a very interesting contribution by Silke Betscher on the situation of refugees living in asylum seekers shelters in Germany. So it really, also quite convincingly deals with the structural inequalities or racism or vulnerability of these refugees and their political legal struggles for their protection and rights in context of the governmental anti-corona measures. Then we had quite a different theme of where Maria Prates addressed the vulnerabilities and also the relational ontologies or etiologies and notions of care among indigenous populations in Brazil. So quite a different topic, but is still kind of dealing with these very unequally distributed vulnerabilities of certain populations. And I think I'll just pick two more contributions, but this will be difficult now to find them quickly. Let me try from Italy, actually. That's not. Yeah, so that's one of, I think, actually only two contributions from Italy by Chiara Bresciani and Jeffrey Hughes, who deal with the dynamics of social solidarity and blame and the social condemnation that was kind of developing and building up in quarantine contexts in Italy. Quite impressive pictures of actually outright violence also against people who kind of, had very opposing views in terms of how to actually stick to the rules. This was also an interesting case because it got, it is entitled Virological Witch Hunts, Coronavirus and Social Control Under Quarantine, Bergamo. And one of the commentaries, no, it doesn't. Oh, yeah. So there was one commentary kind of, criticizing this term witch hunt. Is it not a term to be used in it's not a term to be used in a light-hearted way. And so, yeah, someone was feeling uncomfortable with this terminology, and then they actually also really made an effort to explain why they actually want to stick to this term. So these kinds of exchanges are happening not too often, actually, but they are happening. It's of course a nice possibility to do such, to get into such an exchange in a quite direct way when working with a blog instead of a journal article or so. And the other contribution I want to show you is by Anna Maria Fantuizzi. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and she's actually, I think she joined us today. So I'm very happy to at least know her silently in the audience. Maybe we can also see her later, or maybe she can also say a word about her impressions that she's describing in her contribution. Which I kind of subsumed under this theme of the socio-moral dilemmas and transformations, because she's dealing with these, very existential questions of how dying, the process of dying actually changed a lot under Corona conditions, and people couldn't actually do their, proper burial rituals, even accompany people into their death when they were dying. This situation, this appalling situation of dying alone under lockdown conditions and all these things, what this actually means and how people are struggling with this. So maybe, Anna Maria can join the discussion later. And maybe one, at least, I wanted to get to the last theme of the self-reflection. Maybe just to mention this as a last one, a German contribution by Janina Kehr, sich der Pandemie hingeben, which means like to commit, to devote yourself kind of to the pandemic, writing and nervosity in times of COVID-19. And it was a very early contribution, but also a very nice one, because she very beautifully writes about about her own struggling with taking on this analytical outside perspective on the situation amidst this overwhelming, what she calls, referring to Michael Taussig, the nervousness of the system during the pandemic outbreak. So she really, very nicely describes this kind of inner conflict of, the need to actually just stay on the one side of the discourse, to not even try to get into the analysis mode, because it's just so overwhelming what is happening. But then obviously she did kind of cross this border and offered a very nice analytical perspective on this nervousness of the very first days. And she lives in Alsace, so this area of France, in the east of France, that was so badly hit before Germany actually experienced the pandemic. And so this was kind of the position that she wrote out of. And with this, I will move back to the next slide. It was our intention, not only with this specific series of Witnessing Corona, but I guess it's an aim of our blog per se, is to really aim for diversity in several regards. So you just saw that it's quite, the series itself covered quite a wide range of thematics, thematic foci, of themes. It was also, we thought it was important when we talked about this in the beginning I think we were almost one of the first blogs actually that came up with this idea of having a series on Corona, but the others that started at around the same time were at least tendentially kind of focusing or featuring North American authors, for example, and they weren't too much dealing with the situation in Europe and the global South. So we thought this would be something that we would really attempt to kind of shift, or from the very beginning, distribute these, centers of attention of what's going on in different parts of the world, but specifically also in Europe and in settings of the global South. The blog has always from the beginning been open for a variety of people, of contributors in different career levels. So this is also reflected in the series. So we had actually texts from MA students, very good texts from MA students, up to well-established professors of anthropology, medical anthropology, and so forth. So we had a whole range of people from different levels. We are still offering people to write contributions in German. At the beginning of the blog, when we established the blog in 2014, this was an explicit aim of really also establishing this platform for a German discourse, for a German exchange about medical anthropology, about issues of health and illness from a social scientific perspective. because there was actually, not really much going on in that regard. And we thought it's also important to offer people to write in German, perhaps to kind of lower the threshold, but also to reach perhaps not only an academically oriented audience, beyond the university circles. And finally, we were also open for different formats or genres. We mostly got textual contributions, but now, as you've seen, we also had this documentary film. And one of the contributions, it's kind of a mixture of audio files of audio files that were sent to the authors from Kenya through WhatsApp, I think. So it was a mixture of audio and text formats. And we are still very open for other ideas. Maybe there's someone in the audience who could think of adding to this range. Just a very few numbers. We are very happy that obviously the blog, it really met a great interest, it seems. The numbers of reads are going up continuously since March. So we now reached some 5,000 reads in May. That may give you just a very rough idea of how active. I mean, you never know what a read is or a click and how much people then actually read. But it's it's good to know that it's at least reaching more and more people in some ways. And the numbers of reads or page views of single contributions obviously ranged very much from around 30 to around 1,300. And naturally, there's a correlation to the time since publication. So the longer it is online, the more people read. But it's also not always the case. So some contributions seem to meet, spark a very great interest immediately, while others need, several weeks or months until many people have read them. And it's also interesting to see that in comparison to this kind of temporal trajectory and temporal increase of single contributions, of the page views of single contributions, if you compare the articles of this Witnessing Corona series to the other articles outside of any series, they are kind of gaining traction a lot more quickly. So it also perhaps speaks for at least a more focused or more intense interest in these medical, anthropological, or social science perspectives on Corona. So as a last slide, just very few concluding remarks, but we're also very interested in hearing your to really get into a conversation and to hear about your experiences in your different contexts, but perhaps also about what other people in your series have talked about. And one issue that we found quite interesting throughout these past weeks and months is what may be called editing in real time, which is quite challenging, but also quite interesting. I mean, this whole this working under kind of time pressure, because the pandemic, the developments in the pandemic are actually faster than people can write their texts, and we edit and we send them back and have several rounds of feedback. So I don't know, I have no exact numbers there, but I guess each text took about maybe between 1 and 3 weeks or so to be in the final shape, to be published. And I mean, now if you all know how much happened within 3 weeks. So it was a really challenging situation to actually work with the authors on the texts while observing these vast, developments, quick developments in the surrounding, and also in regard to the specific theme that people were writing about. So it's a quite interesting, experience in terms of editing work. Obviously, we covered very many geographic regions. We had this simultaneous ongoing situation somehow. I mean, the pandemic hit the whole world within quite a short period of time. And so it's also interesting if you kind of see the blog contributions as a tableau where you can compare certain situations. Obviously, there's many similarities in very different contexts at the same time, but there's also very different strategies that were developed, for example, different responses to the same kind of conditions. So this whole, this idea of similarities and divergences in this kind of globally impacting situation, it was interesting to observe through these blog contributions. Then we also, on the other hand, some themes could kind of be described as almost as a wave that kind of started in one place, and then you could observe the wave kind of, moving geographically through the different areas, be it, for example, this issue about the blaming that the Italian colleagues wrote about already 2 months ago. And when at that time in Germany, it was just no issue at all. No, this dynamic just had not started yet. But now, the last couple of weeks, it's really a similar situation of a very polarized population is kind of growing, and it's now I see the similarities to what the colleagues, the Italian colleagues, were describing already 2 months ago. So that's also an interesting kind of aspect of the blog. Yeah, and now we are all, the whole editorial team and all of us, we're all, facing these very uncertain futures of possibly imminent second waves. Nobody knows what's going to happen. It's also an interesting situation, but also somehow, I guess we all have to deal with our very own anxieties in a way. But we also have to take on certain roles as scientists. I mean, we had this enormous discussion, I think, in Germany. I don't know, I'd be very interested in hearing about the role of science and the public discourse about science in the Italian context, for example. And here it was quite a strong discourse, and still anthropology is, as Hans-Jörg said, it's not so present. And I guess anthropology as a discipline, and we all as scientists, as anthropologists, have to take on a specific role. And we'd be very interested in hearing about your take on that. What can be possible ways of engaging beyond such a blog, which is in a way also an engagement, but obviously there's much more to do, and maybe we can take this as a question to open up the floor for the discussion. And we'd really appreciate very much to hear about your experiences. And I leave it there. And I stop sharing the screen so we can perhaps see each other. Well, we only see the blank gray squares. But yeah, so we are ready for questions or the discussion.
Thank you very much, Hans-Jörg and Dominic, for your very interesting thoughts. Very, you gave us a very nice and good idea about what is going on in Germany first, and I saw some similarity with the Italian situation, which are very, very interesting. And the description of your blog was very fascinating. I appreciate a lot, and I hope that this experience can going on, because maybe can be also a way to push the lazy Italians to write more about our situation also in this blog. I don't want to take time because we are already late, so I would like to give the floor to any question. So if there is some question, please book yourself on the chat, or if you prefer, you can also write your question in the chat. So please, any question? Anna Maria Fantuzzi was also invited by Dominic to say something, since she has written there. So if she wants to say something.
Pino, if nobody wants to start, I have a couple of questions to ask. May I? I found very, very interesting the whole presentation, and I wanted to ask to our guests a couple of questions about two topics. The first one concerns the functions of their blog and the response they wanted to give to the kind of expectations that the press, the non-anthropological world was asking to them. I found it very interesting what Hans Jörg said about the discrepancy, about the non-coincidence between what the journalist of Die Welt expected him to say from an anthropological point of view, and the interest that anthropologists sort of cultivate for the social and economic and political aspects of our reality. And I find that your effort to open the blog to non-academic public and to people who not necessarily are familiar with English and with the kind of discourse that we academics use is very, very important. The main problem we have in Italy is exactly that we are sort of too specialized, and we are sort of proud of the kind of inner discourse that we are able to develop, but we do not always make the effort to make ourselves understood to the wider, broader public. So I found it very interesting, and I was wondering how you managed to combine the very heterogeneous kind of contributions you have from several parts of the world in a blog that, being anthropological, should try to cope with the necessity we have to talk about things we have experienced directly on the field. One of the main problems for us now is that we're not allowed to do fieldwork. We have a lot of difficulties in acquiring information, trustworthy information. This is the first question. And the second one concerns the temporal dimension, because you have shown us the growth of the interest for your blog during the last 3 months, an increase that is very, very satisfying. I imagine that you are quite happy with the amount of people who are following you. But I'm wondering, how long will our pandemic last? We probably are not so conscious of how long it will take to overcome the problems we are now facing. In many parts of the world, it is starting, the pandemic is starting to produce its effects. And we probably will have many months or several years perspective to look at. So I was wondering, what is your preview for the future of your blog, as it will probably will have to face very, very long period of dealing with this problem. Thank you.
Hans-Jörg, do you want to start with the media, your experience?
Okay, I can start. Yeah, I think it was an interesting experience because in the beginning there was this interest in a way. I mean, as it's always happening with a new topic, in a way, journalists are also looking for experts, so to say. And there was also since the pandemic was still in a way also happening largely, as at least seen from this German perspective, happening in Asia. So there was all this interest in a way to know what is going on there and how can this be compared to Germany. So there was an interest in a way in talking to anthropologists. But as I said, I mean, the kind of questions they had in a way, then they were really very culturalist. And that has also to do with the way anthropology is perceived as a discipline in Germany. So it's in a way perceived as being the one having expertise about cultures, about cultural differences, and so on. And the more interesting questions I found, they were given to sociologists. So if it came to power relations or about social structure and so on, that's what sociologists were asked about, but not anthropologists. So there's a problem there, but I mean, we faced that, I guess, for a long time already. And probably it's also naive to think that such a dynamic can change in this particular situation. I think the other issue that you addressed was the direct experience. I think that was a challenge also for us and also for the authors writing. I mean, some of them had done field work. They were maybe in a certain context where they had done research and then they were interrupted in a way by the pandemic. And so they were talking about these experiences, or they were doing research on social media. Via social media, or they had contact with interlocutors in the field who sent them these audio files or certain reports, or some people were also writing directly from the Global South, for instance, colleagues there who did in a way research on their own societies or gave a report on the events that were happening there. So there was all these diverse kinds of experiences, and some of them were probably direct and some of them not. And that was a challenge also for us as an editorial team in a way too. But what we said is we are interested in different types of witnessing the epidemic, and this can happen from different kinds of perspectives. We were also especially interested in what we said, what we expected the authors to do is to develop a kind of argument, a conceptual or methodological argument, where they are not simply reporting, but where they, in a way, contributed something to the debate from an anthropological perspective, which would be different from a media article, for instance. Maybe you want to add here, Dominic, also on the time perspective.
Maybe just to add one word on this, the research relations also. I also think it's a very important question, and I mentioned this one contribution by Martin Zillinger and Annalisa Ramella, with the voice messages. And I think they also, because they are posing this question in the end, towards the end of their text, they don't really go into detail then, but they're wondering, so what is our responsibility as a researcher who has entered into these or established these manifold research relationships? We also took on responsibilities for research assistance and so forth. And then us, the privileged researcher, just jumps onto the plane and flies back and is gone. And so they were really struggling, or at least raising this question of where, how to deal with this kind of responsibility, and how to perhaps make special efforts of sustaining these relationships, and also to kind of meet the responsibilities for these people that that are depending on us as researchers too in these settings. So I think that's, it's a very valid and important question, which they unfortunately don't. I mean, maybe this blog project of continuing the work with people there through these audio messages can already be seen as one way of at least keeping up these relations, and also keep working anthropologically from the distance. Concerning the temporal dimension, I guess we don't really have an answer. We're quite aware that unfortunately there probably will be the need for the series to continue for quite a while. It's also really infrastructural question in terms of the capacities of the editorial team. I mean, we in the beginning, when I said we were really flooded by the contributions, we widened, we added people or recruited people, asked people to join us in doing this editing work, and it is really a lot of work, because it is kind of like a peer review, process. It's not blind, obviously, but we really do develop the texts with the authors, I think there were times and days or weeks when even this editorial team of like almost 10 people or so was really at the edge of their capacities. When our assistant wrote us, there's a new contribution, please raise your hands, who will take them via email, and then there's silence for 4 days. It's just, we don't know how much capacity we will have in the months to come to keep up to the pace of the pandemic, but I guess we will try and do our best, and or maybe we're lucky enough that at least for a while we don't have reason so much to, or that the number of submissions kind of goes down due to a sort of calming situation, perhaps here and there. But it's all part of the uncertainty, so we don't know if we have a satisfactory response here.
It is satisfactory. It is a kind of response. I thank you very much for it. I'm wondering if there are some topics that last longer and others that are more ephemeral.
Yeah. Was there a question?
So, Dominique, please.
Sorry?
Are you saying something?
Yeah, I was wondering, so you mean, was that your question, Lupo?
I was just wondering if there are some topics that are more dominant in the blog, that last longer, and others that are more ephemeral. They come out like mushrooms and they last a couple of days and then they're left over.
Please don't try to answer shortly, because there is another question from David Napier.
Yes.
So,
I mean, from a very, a very spontaneous response would be that I think these questions of the inequalities, politically induced inequalities in all kinds of contexts and concerning all kinds of different subpopulations, that's something that really, that's a cross-cutting theme, and I think that will be something, unequal access to medical healthcare and so forth. These are themes that have been there all the time, and that may be, have to be addressed in a reinforced way, even if the pandemic per se maybe calms down a bit, or
okay, so please.
Yes, thank you very much. Hans-Jörg and Dominic, odd meeting you this way, but thank you very much for the really great and highly informative talk. And first of all, I won't make this very quick, Dominic, because I know you have to run. But I just want to say I was very, very much taken by your calling attention to the fact that the truly most vulnerable people clearly are people, especially in the global South, who do not have access to online resources, and therefore, as anthropologists, we are completely incapable of addressing them. And I've been in many global meetings about vulnerability where people now complain about not being able to access vulnerable populations, when indeed, of course, 4 months ago, they could have easily done so. So the question, more easily done so, I should say. So the question here is, how can anthropology actually emphasize the fact that what we really need is not necessarily an emergency response, but the need to be prepared in advance and to understand vulnerability before disasters happen and not during them. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Well, I would probably take this as a comment that I would very much agree with. I don't know if you, Hans-Jörg, do you want to add?
Well, I think as a question, I mean, how can anthropologists actually state the case more clearly? I was very interested by what you were saying about how sociologists, Hans-Jörg, how sociologists are attended to in ways that anthropologists aren't, and anthropologists, at least in Germany, seem to be relegated to commenting on cultural practices rather than on social inequality.
Yeah. No, first of all, maybe just to say hello, David. It's very nice to see you here. It's unexpected, but very nice. So it's no, I think that's a great question, a very important question. But I think also anthropologies are in different situations in different countries, obviously. And what we had here with COVID-19 is in a way that I think the global north, in a way, also Northern Europe, in a way, they never thought that this is going to happen to them. So pandemics always stayed, in a way, distant. And if it came to certain global crises, then they hit, maybe if it came to the financial crisis, it was Southern Europe. But Germany, in a way, always felt safe and always like, fenced off against these global disasters in a way. And I think that was also part of the way they reacted also politically. You could really see that also in January, February, where there was still talk by the Ministry of Health that this is never going to happen to us in a way. This is going to stay far, far away. For us as anthropologists, I think it was also a very interesting situation to witness this time and to see what is happening in our immediate surroundings and in various places of the world, and really building an archive of these various responses and how different countries reacted to it, how different people around the world in a way experienced the situation very differently. And obviously that also differs. I mean, people in Germany had a very different, I guess, experience of the situation than, for instance, in South Africa, people who had gone through all these epidemic crises for many years and decades. So they had a very different type of experience, and I think that's interesting in a way also to well, this doesn't really answer your question, but now I come to the answer. I think maybe it helpful in relation to Germany at least. It showed also to certain agencies and also politically that anthropologists are needed in such a pandemic response. And global health is also coming slowly only as a topic and as an interdisciplinary topic, but it's really coming, it's evolving. There is the World Health Summit every year in Berlin, as you well know. But I think now, for instance, in Berlin, there's now also a response that there's a increasing focus on global health. And anthropologists are now also on board in a way. They are becoming included in this response and in the structures that are being established. But that's very recent, that's very new. That's very different also from, I think, places like the UK or like the US, where anthropologists have been involved in all these discussions, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary discussions, for a much longer time than, for instance, in Germany. But I see that this is happening, and I think there's a connection also with COVID-19 because there was some intention in a way to anthropology and to the potential role that anthropology can play. And I'm very determined in a way to use this opportunity also of this particular context, since there is an interest in anthropology and just to see how we can play our role there. Since there's now more focus on global health, one of the topics, and this is now really leading to your question, is pandemic preparedness. There's now much more interest in that in Germany, because now they know that they have to take these pandemic threats more seriously, and they need to establish structures in a way, interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary structures, in order to be prepared for such a pandemic threat in the future. If it's not in a way enough for the here and now, but they want to establish structures, I think, for the future, for future pandemic threats. So I hope that there's an opening there in a way.
I totally agree. Thank you very much.
That's an opportunity also for, I think, transnational collaboration, and where it's important in a way to have more conversations also across national borders among anthropologists, I think.
Maybe if I can add one sentence also concerning your questions, David. I mean, now so many things become obvious that, the fault lines of our society become so, gleaming almost through the pandemic. If you take this recent mass outbreak in the meat industry in parts of Germany, now, I mean, this has been known for, many years. But there was no political response. Now it's the opportunity for, or enough pressure is there for politicians to finally at least start thinking about it, to counter these very appalling, precarious working conditions of the laborers in the meat industry, just as one example. But I think many things it's just so become so obvious to a very wide public what is going on. In terms of really appalling inequities in our society, in very different spots somehow that kind of suddenly come up, and it's a new spark that sparks a whole discourse about these living and working conditions. And it's probably too naive to think that there will be sort of really sustainable solutions for that, but at least the politics has to, react in a way, and we'll see where it takes us.
Thank you.
Carla Braga wants to say something. Carla Braga.
Can you hear me? Hello?
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. I was not thinking of making any intervention, but after the last, I'm sure Dilger mentioned something about dialogues among anthropologists from different parts of the world. I said, okay, I will definitely say something. I am a medical anthropologist. I'm writing, and I live in Mozambique. And as you were mentioning, thanks SIAM for this opportunity, the role of science during this epidemic. And something I want to share with you is in Mozambique, it's something from well before COVID-19. The role of science is almost equated to the role of biomedicine. It's related to the social status, social capital of MDs in this context. Maybe you were not expecting this kind of thing. For instance, some of our foreign affairs ministers have been medical doctors, prime ministers, and so forth. And I also see the weight of even the word scientific, you know. For instance, for COVID-19, there is an advisory board, but it's named Technical Scientific Advisory Board, and it's never mentioned just as advisory board. As there is this need to relate it to science, you know, and I am hypothesizing that this might be in relation to somehow the paradigm of modernity associated with science and technology, and somehow an expectation and a desire, I would say, a desire of belonging, you know, expressed in these terms. And of course, this has very many other, how can I say, many other issues related to. I hope I passed my message through. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Carla. I think you're absolutely right. I think also biomedicine, also in Germany, I mean, and virology has played a major role in a way in responding to the epidemic, and they gained a really strong public presence. And biomedicine obviously is not biomedicine. I mean, it's also very diverse. I mean, the virologists probably would never have dreamt of being just in the media focus for months in a way, or becoming in a way really like almost pop stars. So it's that's very interesting in a way also. But I think you're absolutely right. One needs to be very vigilant in a way in relation to the situation and how it develops, because even if there is also in Germany, for instance, interest in the social sciences and certain social scientific perspectives, but it's very quickly happening that in a way then certain structures are being established, and then it's purely biomedical in the end. Again, for instance, there's one example of the German Research Foundation. Now they established like an advisory board on COVID-19 in a way that they've give advice in relation to certain funding initiatives that should be established, funding programs. And if you look at this board, suddenly it's purely biomedical, with maybe one or two quantitative social scientists. So again, you know, it's happening. First, there's all this emphasis. Yeah, it's so important to have qualitative researchers and a different perspective, but then different structures are being established again. So it's important to be vigilant there, and to intervene or to respond and to raise this issue in the form of letters or talking to these people there, and trying to get a seat in these various forums. And I'm sure that's not possible everywhere, but in certain instances, as structures are being established, it's important just to be vigilant and to try in a way to become or remain part of the conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I don't see any question, but it's also 8 o'clock. So maybe we can thank our speakers. Thank you very much for your very fascinating talks. And I'm so happy to meet you again, as we know each other since a long time. And I would like to just to remember everyone, next meeting is on July 2nd, David Napier. So I hope you can join us again, and I wish you a nice evening. So I don't know if Alessandro wants to say something.
I just want to say thank you, everybody. It was a pleasure to meet David before today and have him talk with some of our speakers. Carla Braga was with us every time since the beginning of our seminar, and it's a real pleasure to put in touch people from various parts of the world. I think that this pandemic will be a tragedy for many people, a great opportunity to exchange ideas, experiences, points of view, and to make our society develop more thorough sensitivity towards the enormous problem of social inequalities, of economic unbalance in our world. And the very fact that the different responses to the pandemic have been so diverse throughout the world is a problem that stresses the importance of institutions, culture, society throughout the different areas, political realities and societies. So I think that the role of anthropologists will increase if we are able to spend our knowledge wisely in different situations, and if some of us are so successful as our friends in Germany to invent and let live such a marvelous thing as the blog you have created in Germany. Let's wish long life to your blog. Let's hope to have many other occasions to chat, to interchange our points of view. Thank you once again very, very much for sharing your time with us, your experience, and hope to see you soon on our platform and in our seminar.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much to everybody. Thank you for having us. And of course, everybody's also invited to contribute to our blog. So we are looking also forward to new submissions. And if you want to spread the news about the blog, we are very grateful.
We certainly will do it.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Goodbye. All the best.
Thank you.
Bye, David.
Thank you very much. Bye. See you on the 2nd. Bye.